Imagine a glittering banquet hall, its stone walls echoing with laughter, music, and the clinking of goblets. Lords boast of their conquests, ladies parade in silks, and the tables overflow with roasted meats and spiced wine. Yet behind the splendor lies a hidden world, a shadowy corner where enslaved women move silently, unseen except when needed. They pour the wine, carry the trays, and wipe the spills, all while knowing they themselves are considered possessions no different from the goblets in noble hands. This is the unspoken truth of medieval Europe. Behind the grand stories of knights and kings, slavery persisted, not as a shameful exception, but as a normalized institution. Women, in particular, bore the heaviest chains, both visible and invisible. They were bought, traded, inherited, and abused, their fates dictated by wealth, war, and whim. We often imagine medieval slavery as distant from the European heartlands, something confined to ancient Rome or the far-off Ottoman world. But Europe itself, its castles, its cities, its marketplaces, was built on the backs of the enslaved. Female slaves lived in kitchens, in bedchambers, in fields. Some were paraded as luxuries, others discarded as tools. Their silence has long been mistaken for absence. Chroniclers wrote of kings and crusaders, rarely of the servant girls who cleaned their armor or warmed their beds. Yet their presence was everywhere, a hidden backbone of medieval households and economies. What did life look like for these women? How did markets reduce them to commodities? How did the law define their humanity or erase it entirely? And most painfully, how did they endure lives where even their bodies were not their own? The medieval feast is a perfect metaphor. At the table, the nobles feasted on glory. Behind them, women carried chains the world chose not to see. This is their story, and to tell it, we must step beyond the myths of shining castles and gallant knights and descend into the dark corridors where history's forgotten lived and suffered. For behind every castle wall, there were chains. Behind every glittering hall, silent footsteps echoed. And behind the myth of medieval glory was a reality more brutal than most can imagine. Now, let us walk into the markets where those women's lives first began to be priced and sold. The story of female slavery in medieval Europe began not in the castle halls, but on the brutal paths of capture and commerce. Entire lives were torn apart in the chaos of raids. Villages burned, families scattered, women and girls dragged from their homes to be marched in chains toward distant markets. For many, that first night of captivity was the last time they would ever see their homeland. The markets themselves were both ordinary and horrifying. In places like Venice, Genoa, and Constantinople, they operated openly, their cries mingling with the noise of fishmongers and spice traders. Women stood in rows, stripped and inspected as buyers calculated their worth. The trade was systematic, almost bureaucratic. A woman's beauty could inflate her price. Her age, health, and obedience determined whether she was destined for labor, concubinage, or both. Ethnicity mattered deeply. Slavic women from Eastern Europe were so commonly enslaved that their very name gave birth to the word slave. Fair-haired captives fetched high prices in Mediterranean markets, where they were considered exotic. Conversely, women from North Africa or the Middle East carried different value, prized for their perceived resilience or exotic allure. Religion was equally important. Christians taken by Muslims and Muslims captured by Christians became not only slaves but trophies of faith used to display dominance over the enemy's women. The degradation did not stop with sale. Many women were branded with hot irons, burned into the flesh of shoulder or thigh. This was not only a mark of ownership, but a cruel denial of individuality, transforming a living person into an object defined by a symbol. Records describe the smell of burning skin, the cries of the newly marked, scenes meant to remind both slave and master of who held power. Merchants treated this human traffic with chilling pragmatism. Ships that carried spices, silk, and precious metals also carried women, shackled in holds, traded along the same routes. A nobleman in Paris or Seville could send a letter and receive a servant girl, delivered as easily as a barrel of wine. Enslaved women were part of the fabric of commerce, woven into Europe's economic system with brutal efficiency. But what was most devastating was the erasure of identity. A girl captured from a Baltic village could be renamed, her language forbidden, her culture erased. In the eyes of her new master, she was not someone's daughter or sister. She was a commodity, a possession, a silent investment of flesh. The market ended with the jingle of coins, but for the women, their ordeal was only beginning. From the auction block, they were led into households, palaces, or farms, where the chains of commerce were replaced by subtler ones: obedience, silence, and fear. Their new life awaited, hidden behind doors where history seldom dared to look. If the slave market was a theater of humiliation, the household was a prison of silence. For enslaved women, this was where daily bondage unfolded, not in open chains, but in endless, unrelenting duties. From dawn to nightfall, they swept courtyards, scrubbed pots, fetched water, polished armor, and prepared meals they would never taste. Their labor kept noble families clothed, fed, and comfortable, yet their presence was scarcely acknowledged. But their role went far beyond labor. Enslaved women often lived in the most intimate spaces of their masters, tending to children, managing wardrobes, even sleeping within reach of the Lord's chamber. That closeness gave them no safety. It only deepened their vulnerability. Many were treated not simply as servants, but as forced companions, available at a master's whim. Their status left them defenseless. Refusal was not an option, complaint was unthinkable, and escape carried the threat of mutilation or death. Within aristocratic households, even freeborn wives saw these women not as sisters in suffering, but as rivals. Chronicles and letters revealed jealous noblewomen lashing out at enslaved maids who caught their husband's attention. The enslaved bore the punishment for sins they never chose. They could be beaten by the wife for imagined seductions, then summoned by the husband for forced intimacy, trapped in a cycle of blame with no voice to defend themselves. Imagine, for a moment, a servant girl crouched in the great hall, polishing the steel plates of her master's armor. Her hands sting from the coarse cloth. Her back aches from hours of work, but her mind races with a different fear. At any moment, a guard might summon her. She may be ordered to carry wine to the Lord, to tend to his children, or to enter his bedchamber. She cannot refuse. The clang of armor in her hands is a cruel reminder. She maintains the tools of his power, yet has none herself. The cruel paradox of domestic bondage was its invisibility. To outsiders, these women might appear part of the household, indistinguishable from free servants, but their chains lay in their lack of choice. They could not marry without permission. They could not leave. They could not keep what they earned. Their entire existence was owned, right down to the children they might bear. Even in cities where enslaved women served merchants or artisans rather than nobles, the story was the same. They worked in shops, cared for infants, and cooked meals, yet always with the knowledge that their status made them expendable. If they displeased their owners, they could be sold, traded, or abandoned at a moment's notice. And yet, despite such suffocating control, enslaved women carved out fleeting moments of resilience. Whispered songs while washing clothes by the river, stolen glances of sisterhood in crowded kitchens, silent prayers muttered before sleep. These small acts of humanity were their only rebellion in households that erased their voices. But for many, the household was not the end of their suffering. Behind the chores, behind the quiet routines, lurked an even darker truth. Enslaved women were not only bound to serve, but to surrender their very bodies as property. The harshest truth of female slavery in medieval Europe was this: their bodies were never their own. In the eyes of the law and society, an enslaved woman's consent did not exist. She could be commanded to scrub a floor or to share a bed, and both were viewed as equally enforceable duties of her condition. Concubinage was common, though rarely spoken of openly. Lords and merchants kept enslaved women as unofficial wives, using them for pleasure while denying them honor. In some courts, these women were paraded as tokens of wealth, living ornaments, simultaneously desired and despised. But most endured their role in silence, hidden in back chambers where abuse was routine and unrecorded. Pregnancy was not a private matter, but another form of exploitation. A child born to an enslaved mother was often considered property of the master, not a free human being. This meant that an owner who forced himself upon an enslaved woman could increase his own wealth with every birth. The womb became an economic tool. The most intimate violation turned into profit. Children could be raised to serve or sold away while still young, their mothers left with nothing but grief. The church, in theory, condemned sexual abuse. Priests thundered from pulpits about chastity, sin, and the sanctity of marriage. Yet in practice, silence often prevailed. Nobles who filled monasteries with donations rarely faced discipline for keeping enslaved concubines. The hypocrisy was devastating. The same institution that declared the soul equal in God's eyes allowed countless women to suffer in shadows. Unprotected by the faith meant to shield them. The law reflected this same contradiction. In some medieval codes, harming another man's enslaved woman was punishable not because of the woman's suffering, but because it damaged property. A raped servant was seen less as a victim than as damaged goods, her value reduced like a broken tool. Such thinking erased her humanity at its core, and yet, within this cruelty, a quiet resilience flickered. Some enslaved women formed bonds with their children, protecting them fiercely, even under impossible conditions. Others found ways to resist intimacy, feigning illness or seeking refuge with sympathetic members of the household. There are whispers and chronicles of women who took drastic measures, fleeing, hiding pregnancies, or even ending their own lives rather than submitting to their master's demands. Still, for most, there was no escape. Their bodies were battlegrounds where power and desire collided, leaving scars both seen and unseen. A nobleman's glory might be sung in epic poems, but the women enslaved in his household would never be named. Their suffering was absorbed into silence, their stories buried beneath the weight of property laws and patriarchal privilege. And yet, to understand medieval slavery, we must look beyond economics and beyond daily chores. We must see how institutions, law, religion, and custom colluded to strip enslaved women of their very humanity, weaving chains that were not only physical, but spiritual and legal. This brings us to the most chilling layer of bondage, the way faith and law themselves justified the chains. Perhaps the most unsettling truth of medieval slavery is that it was not merely tolerated, it was justified. Faith and law, the very pillars meant to uphold morality, became instruments that chained women more tightly to their masters. Christian theology often denounced the enslavement of fellow believers, yet it carved out exceptions that made the practice thrive. Non-Christians, pagans, Muslims, Jews were deemed legitimate targets for bondage. Enslaving them was framed as a tool of conversion, a way to save their souls while exploiting their bodies. The contradiction was glaring. The same priests who preached mercy also blessed knights who returned from crusades with women bound in chains. Legal codes echoed this hypocrisy. In many medieval kingdoms, enslaved women were defined as both person and property, human enough to be punished for crimes, yet object enough to be sold, traded, or gifted. A master who struck his servant might be rebuked, but one who forced her into his bed often faced no penalty at all. The law spoke of justice, but it was justice only for the free. Church councils occasionally condemned abuse, warning lords not to exploit their female slaves. Yet the warnings were hollow, for enforcement was almost non-existent. Wealth and influence shielded abusers from consequence. Clergy themselves were not immune. Records exist of monasteries and bishops' households where enslaved women labored, their suffering sanctified by silence. For enslaved women, the weight of this dual system was crushing. They lived under laws that recognized their pain only when it touched property rights, and under a religion that offered salvation in heaven but little protection on earth. The message was clear. Their bondage was ordained not only by men, but seemingly by God. Yet not all voices were complicit. Some theologians argued passionately that slavery violated the dignity of creation, insisting that Christ's sacrifice made all souls equal. A handful of legal codes attempted to soften the harshest conditions, granting enslaved women the right to marry or to seek refuge in certain sanctuaries. But these measures were rare and often ignored. The overwhelming reality remained. Institutions that could have challenged slavery instead rationalized it. Faith became a weapon, law a cage. The chains on women's bodies were forged as much in courts and cathedrals as in markets and castles. And yet, history does not end with their silence. For within the cracks of this oppressive system, some women found ways to defy their fate, to flee, to fight, to resist in ways both loud and invisible. Their defiance, though often unrecorded, was real. Though the weight of bondage was crushing, not every enslaved woman bowed silently. Resistance existed, though it often flickered in the shadows, fragile and dangerous. For some, defiance meant flight. Chronicles tell of women who slipped away under cover of darkness, vanishing into forests or cities, risking capture, mutilation, or death rather than endure another day of servitude. Others resisted more quietly, a poisoned cup of wine left on a master's table, a fire set in a barn, a child secretly baptized to preserve a mother's faith. These were acts of rebellion carved out in desperation, where a single mistake could bring savage punishment. Yet even these small gestures mattered. They were proof that the enslaved were never fully broken. Tragically, some resistance took the form of self-destruction. Stories emerge of women who chose death over dishonor, flinging themselves from towers, rivers, or walls to escape violation. Their choices, harrowing as they are, reflect the depths of despair within a world that left them no other escape. But for every act of rebellion recorded, countless others remained hidden. Most enslaved women endured in silence, their suffering unmarked in chronicles dominated by kings and battles. Their resistance was survival itself, the act of continuing to live, to endure, to nurture fragments of dignity in a system designed to erase it. In the kitchens, in the fields, in the shadowed corners of great halls, enslaved women sang, prayed, and whispered their names to one another, preserving humanity in spaces meant to deny it. These whispers are faint in the historical record, but they remind us that even in bondage, they were not merely victims, but human beings clinging to defiance in whatever form they could grasp. And while their voices are faint, their legacy is not. For every quiet act of resistance rippled forward, challenging the myth that slavery was accepted, natural, or uncontested. Yet history does not confine itself to the past. The story of women reduced to property does not end with medieval Europe. It reverberates into the present. We often comfort ourselves with the idea that the horrors of slavery belong to another age, that the dark corridors of medieval castles and markets are far removed from our modern world. But the truth is far more unsettling. The echoes of medieval bondage still resound today, transformed but never silenced. Across the globe, millions of women remain trapped in systems of exploitation that mirror the past. Human trafficking networks operate in shadows, not unlike the medieval markets, reducing women and children to commodities traded for profit. The methods differ, but the logic remains the same. A woman's body as property, her labor as currency, her freedom as negotiable. Modern slavery takes many forms: forced labor in factories, domestic servitude behind closed doors, sexual exploitation in brothels and online markets. Just as in medieval Europe, beauty, youth, and vulnerability determine price and demand. Just as before, law and faith often look the other way, too weak or unwilling to confront the full horror. The parallels are chilling. Medieval nobles justified bondage through religion and conquest. Traffickers today justify it through poverty, corruption, and demand. In both worlds, the victims are silenced, hidden, their suffering dismissed as inevitable. And in both, it is women who bear the heaviest chains. But history does not only warn, it demands. By remembering the enslaved women of medieval Europe, we recognize the long shadow of exploitation. Their forgotten lives teach us that slavery was never natural, never acceptable, only enforced by those who profited from silence. To forget them is to risk repeating the same blind indifference in our own time. We cannot free the women who lived and died behind castle walls, nor erase the scars of markets where their names were lost. But we can honor them by refusing to ignore the women who suffer still. We can choose to see what others hide, to speak where silence once ruled, and to recognize that exploitation, whether in the 13th century or the 21st, is a crime against humanity itself. History is not just a record of the past, it is a mirror. When we look into it, we must ask ourselves, are we so different from those who dined in glittering halls while women served in chains? Or do we carry the same blind spots, the same capacity to look away? The chains behind medieval castle walls may have rusted away, but their echoes remain. To hear them is to understand that the fight for dignity and freedom is not finished. It is our inheritance, our warning, and our responsibility.